In this unit, we've been learning about plant nutrition and the process of photosynthesis, whereby plants can make their own food. The food that plants make is a sugar called glucose, a very valuable molecule. It can be used as a building material, but there's lots of energy stored up in these chemical bonds, and so this is a fuel to power the chemistry of life in a plant cell. Now, plants use two simple ingredients in their environment to build glucose: water molecules and carbon dioxide molecules. And so we see here in a water molecule, we have two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen. In a carbon dioxide molecule, we have one atom of carbon and two oxygen atoms. But these three types of atoms are all you need to build this sugar. Glucose has carbon atoms, oxygen atoms, and hydrogen atoms. So from these two simple building materials, the plant will make a glucose molecule. There are leftover oxygen atoms that are released as molecules of oxygen. So the balanced reaction is 6 water molecules and 6 carbon dioxide molecules are being used to build 1 molecule of glucose, and 6 molecules of oxygen are released as waste. Here we have the photosynthesis equation: carbon dioxide and water on the left, and glucose and oxygen on the right. Now you'll notice glucose has 6 oxygen atoms here, but both of the starting materials have oxygen. So it raised a question: where are these oxygens coming from? Is the oxygen in glucose coming from the water or from the carbon dioxide, or both? And likewise with the oxygen being released as a waste, is that oxygen coming from the water or the carbon dioxide, or both? And this question was nicely answered in the mid-1900s using radioactivity to trace oxygen atoms. So I'm going to put a little red mark above the oxygen and carbon dioxide. So scientists were able to make carbon dioxide molecules with radioactive oxygen. And likewise, they were able to make water molecules with radioactive oxygen, with little blue asterisks here. And so by using one or the other, you can then just sort of let the plant grow with one or the other nutrient and examine where is the radioactivity showing up in the products. So when the oxygen in carbon dioxide is made radioactive, then you find that the glucose is radioactive and that the released oxygen is not radioactive. And this establishes that the oxygen in carbon dioxide is being used to build the glucose. On the other hand, when you make the oxygen in water radioactive, you find that glucose is not radioactive. It doesn't have radioactive oxygens, but indeed the released oxygen is radioactive. So this was clear evidence that the plants are using the carbon dioxide molecules to build the glucose here, and it is only the hydrogens, in a sense, from the water that are being used to construct the glucose. So the hydrogen in glucose comes from the water, but the oxygen in the water is being released as a waste. All of the atoms in carbon dioxide are effectively used to build the glucose molecule. Now this green area here is intended to represent a plant cell. In a plant cell, you will find a nucleus. DNA resides in the nucleus, and we'll learn about how DNA stores the recipes to build important proteins that do the chemistry of life in the plant cell. But we're going to be focusing on these green disc-like structures. They're membrane-bound structures called chloroplasts, and it is in chloroplasts where photosynthesis takes place. They are green because the surface of the chloroplast is covered with molecules called chlorophyll, and here we've extracted the chlorophyll by boiling leaves in alcohol, and we see that the chlorophyll molecules are green. Now, what they are doing is these are the molecules that are absorbing certain wavelengths of light, certain colors of light. As it turns out, the chlorophylls absorb red light and blue light, and they reflect the green light. So we see the chloroplasts and plant cells as green. So it is in the chloroplast where photosynthesis takes place. We can think of them as little sugar factories. Now, in order to use the simple molecules of water and carbon dioxide and the atoms contained inside to make glucose, the chemical bonds of these molecules must be broken so that the atoms can be rearranged to build glucose. And that requires energy. So it takes energy to break these chemical bonds and to rebuild new bonds to make glucose. That energy, of course, comes from the sun. So what plants are doing is they're harnessing solar energy and converting it into chemical energy, the energy stored inside chemical bonds of this sugar, glucose. So it is in the chloroplast where photosynthesis is building sugar molecules. Now, what does the plant do after it builds glucose? Well, it can be used as a building material in the plant cell wall, but if the plant is going to use the glucose as an energy source, it's going to rip it apart again. So it just built the glucose, but now the idea is there's lots of energy stored in these chemical bonds, and by breaking these chemical bonds, by destroying the molecule itself, energy will be released, and that energy can be captured in various forms and used to power cellular chemistry. So photosynthesis will build the glucose, and then the cell is going to metabolize the glucose, break it down. And a lot of that chemistry goes on in a structure called the mitochondria. So mitochondria are, again, membrane-bound structures, and it is here where the cell is going to be metabolizing or burning the glucose. And the released energy will be harnessed to power cellular activities. This chemistry in the mitochondria requires oxygen. And so some of the oxygen produced during photosynthesis can be used for the ongoing chemistry in mitochondria. Now, we've learned that the plants are using sunlight to break the chemical bonds of water molecules, and it is the oxygen in water that gets liberated as the waste oxygen back out into the atmosphere. But I'm going to demonstrate a similar process using a different energy source. Instead of sunlight, we're going to use a battery. We're going to use a battery to split these water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen atoms that will then form their own molecules. Specifically, what we'll have then is the balanced reaction would be we'll start with two water molecules. The energy of the battery is going to break the chemical bonds, and the oxygen atoms will associate and form an oxygen molecule, and the hydrogen atoms will associate, forming hydrogen gas. So we start with water molecules. We're going to break the chemical bonds. The atoms will rearrange into a molecule of oxygen and two molecules of hydrogen. Notice this is the balanced reaction. We start with 4 hydrogen atoms over here on the left. We have 4 on the right. We start with 2 oxygens on the left. We have the 2 oxygens in 1 molecule of oxygen right there. So what you're witnessing then in this battery setup is we're using these wires. They go down and there is exposed wire in the solution. This is a saltwater solution. So salt water conducts electricity, so we can complete a circuit, as it were. And at the black and the red terminals there, at the electrodes there, there's different chemistry going on. In one of the tubes, we are collecting hydrogen gas. In the other tube, we're collecting oxygen gas. Let me see if we can zoom in here and kind of see some bubbling. The tube there that you see, some bubbling action there, that's the hydrogen being collected. Now the other tube would be where oxygen is being collected, but there's some other chemistry going on, so we're not seeing a lot of oxygen production. But there's the hydrogen production. Now, this has been running for maybe 10 minutes or so. So hydrogen gas is flammable, and we're going to attempt to burn the hydrogen gas, thus sort of driving the reaction in the opposite direction. When you burn hydrogen, you're chemically combining it with oxygen. And what is the product? Water again. So you see what we can do is sort of just drive this reaction in either direction using the battery. We're splitting water molecules into oxygen and hydrogen, and then when we burn the hydrogen, the flame is going to break some chemical bonds here, and so the hydrogen atoms will react with oxygen in the air, and that will form water molecules. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, let's try to set this up here. So I've got my trusty lighter here, and we're going to light the candle. And now I'm going to stop the power going to the electrodes. So I'll disconnect one of these here. And in fact, I just want the tube collecting the hydrogen. So I'm going to carefully remove the tube, let the water drain, and then I'm going to put the tube over the flame, and we'll see if we can detect any combustion. So I'm going to let the excess water drain a little bit. And now, here we go, the moment of truth. All right, that sound you heard was a small explosion. That was hydrogen gas in the presence of the flame. The flame is going to break some chemical bonds in the hydrogen molecules. The hydrogens are going to chemically combine with the oxygens and will form water molecules. And when it's a rapid combustion like that, you can sort of hear the sound of the rapid reaction as a small little explosion.